And I've also helped create a new journal that I'm promoting right now called the Advances in Economics Education with Elgar. It is a journal that will specialize in education. The editor is Peter Doherty, wrote a really nice book in 1990 on endogenous money. So I was very happy when he accepted. And the first issue will be coming out in October. So if you are working in education or how to, curriculum issues, how to reform the curriculum, this would be a great journal for you. On that note, I am publishing, speaking of reforming the curriculum, I'm publishing a symposium on reforming the curriculum along gender lines. And so that will be coming out next year, and it's guest edited by a really promising young scholar called Melanie Long, who's at the College of Worcester. Also, I created the Monetary Policy Institute, and we're doing quite a few projects. Some of it is a series of 10 books that will be coming out in 2022 and 2023, each dealing with a specific topic. For example, we're having one on central banking, monetary policy, and gender. It was a very difficult book to put together because there's not a lot of research on the topic. But we're hoping that the book will anchor and legitimize that line of research. And it's co-edited with a young Brazilian called Kappes, who is, where's Silvio? What university? Sierra.
No, Sierra.
Thank you. And we're doing one on policy, monetary policy implementation, dollarization, income distribution, financialization, financial stability, social responsibility and democracy. So the whole concept of central bank independence, how is it related to democratic values, the environment, which is an important book and a fun book to do, and the future of money, electronic money, Bitcoin, and all that. If you are doing work on central banking, please let me know, because you could always add space in some of these books, especially for young scholars and doctoral students. All these books have already some doctoral students in it. I always think it's important to incorporate young scholars. And on that, we have one that we're working on right now on shadow banking. So if you're doing work on shadow banking and the links with monetary policy, contact me. And especially if you're doing work on income distribution. So a big focus of the research that we're doing and the monetary blog that I recently created that you might be familiar with, a lot of the focus is on income distribution. And we're trying to put together a research group of young scholars around the world who are doing work on inequality, income, wealth inequality, maybe even along gender lines, along racialized minority. The latest blog was published yesterday by Melanie Long is on gender and race issues with respect to inequality in monetary policy. We're hosting a conference in September on income distribution in not my hometown, where I live now, Toronto. And we're doing a big one. Silvio Kappes and I approached the Bank of Italy, and we said, hey, why don't we do a conference on this? And surprisingly, they said yes. There's a guy over there who's not heterodox, but he's a data guy. And he, if you let the data talk, there's no other ways but reach heterodox conclusions. So it was really open-minded, and they're throwing a lot of money. And if you're working on that topic, they're ready to pay for your trip or most of your trip. So please let me know. And there'll be a YSI event both in Toronto and in Naples and in Toronto with Massimo Pivetti and Marc Lavoie. So it's going to be very, and Melody Long, there you go, she pops up all the time now. And in July in Rio 2023, we're doing a conference on demand-led growth, and there's going to be a whole section, first time ever, on trying to combine the super multiplier, the Schraffian super multiplier with endogenous money. So that's going to be a separate symposium in the review of political economy. Just to mention two books that are coming out now. One is A Brief History of Economic Thought, from the mercantilists to the post-Keynesians. I wrote the chapter on post-Keynesians, but it has, Steve Pressman in it, and Matthias Jarnengo, and a number of other people, John King, and other people. John King wrote a really good paper, chapter on the Keynesians, and the Encyclopedia of Post-Keynesian Economics, that's coming out very soon. That was a big undertaking. Finally, to piggyback on what Gary said yesterday, dedicating his talk to three giants, I'm dedicating my own talk today to a friend, a mentor, scholar, an intellectual. Did I say friend? A very good friend, deep friend for the past 35 years, Alain Kappes, who was the founder of the French School of Monetary Circuits, a large inspiration behind stock flow modeling. In fact, Lavoie is editing a special issue of Egypt on the links between the monetary circuit and stock flow modeling, in which I have a paper, but I think it all goes back to people like Alain and Augusto Graziani in Italy. Okay, presentation today. It's based on a book that I'm currently writing. I've written a lot on endogenous money and theory, and the original plan was to do a second edition of my 1999 book, but I think we need to stop talking about the differences between structuralists and horizontalists and all of that. The debate is settled. We're all horizontalists, and the facts of the banking facts are telling this. And so, in trying to figure out what I could do, I've been doing more policy in recent years, and I figured this would be a good policy book. And the book is essentially two parts. I'm going to focus on the first part, and at the end, I'm going to just have a little bit to say on the second part. But maybe that's going to lead to questions. And the book is, largely written for undergraduates. And you'll see this how. It's very pedagogical, because I find that, there's lots and lots of books on post-Keynesian economics for graduates and for, advanced people. The go-to book, someone wrote on Twitter the other day, post-Keynesian economics is what Lavoie says it is. But, there's a lot of, this is a phenomenal book. Phenomenal. Barker's my mentor. I've known him for 40 years. But I think there's a need to start developing pedagogical or articles or books for undergraduates. And this is one of the reasons I started the Advances in Economics Education Journal, because there's a need. Do you have a question? No. Oh, because there's a need to, I think, to talk about how do we teach undergraduates, how do we approach that, and how do we reform the curriculum and all that. Okay, so, but I think that while there has been a lot of criticism of new consensus models, which is what the first chapter does, the Main Street view, what I do here is a systematic, step-by-step deconstruction of the model, which is why the chapter is called Deconstructing Monetary Policy. So it's an interesting time to be talking about central banks with inflation hitting the double digits in England and almost double digits everywhere else. Central banks are roaring back with a vengeance in some countries. Certainly in the United States and in Canada, monetary policy has been rather aggressive in the last 4 or 5 months. And a lot of people have told me, that the new consensus model is dead. So why do you want to deconstruct a new consensus model? I don't think it's dead. I think it's been dormant, because there hasn't been any inflation for the last 15 years or so. And so central banks were given the freedom of not, getting into that knee-jerk reaction of raising interest rates whenever inflation was above target. But we see it now that this model, this philosophy, is very well still entrenched in central banks. In Canada, interest rates went from 0.5 to 2.5 in the matter of mere months. Same thing in the United States. Lavoie has called that the new consensus model the bread and butter of central bank research, which he reasserted in his latest edition of the book. De Paula, another Brazilian, has argued in a 2016 paper, which is unpublished, which I'm trying to get him to revise so I can publish it in the journal. He says, new consensus remains the hardcore model, and the core is unchanged and remains a dominant view. So, and this is a good quote from a Federal Reserve guy, an older quote, but I think this is precisely, it sums up precisely what happened post-1998. But he says, the Fed may respond modestly or not at all during, extended periods of time, which I think was the case with the financial crisis. But this pattern of behavior may be interrupted by periods when the Fed responds more aggressively to a single object. So I think this summarizes very well what has happened in the last 6 months or a year or so. Now, the mainstream, the new consensus model has 2 parts to it. There's a policy component, the Taylor rule, and there's a transmission mechanism component, which is largely the IS curve and the Phillips curve. And there's different mechanisms, the interest rate channel and the credit channel, but I'm just going to summarize it as the IS curve. That is certainly what the model is set up to do. And when Lavoie calls the model, there's been some changes over the last 30 years. Central banks admit to controlling the rate of interest and not the money supply. The Taylor rule is specifically a real interest rate rule. So that's a big sort of improvement. But when Lavoie calls it old wine in a new bottle, and to be clear, it's still a very monetarist model, there are some fundamentals that will never change in whatever incarnation of the mainstream model is. First, monetary policy may not be a monetary phenomenon, but it is still a monetary policy phenomenon. It's still linked to monetary policy, right? The whole concept of monetary policy dominance is the idea that, maybe less so with COVID, but certainly the idea that central banks alone could fight inflation, and certainly a very small role, if at all, for fiscal policy. So, you have to leave inflation to the big boys in central banks and let governments step aside on the question. Long run neutrality of money. So any change in interest rates have short run effects. That in the long run, policy is neutral. And this is a very interesting core assumption, because you see this assumption clearly in the mainstream literature on central banks and income inequality, and central banks and the environment. I've looked at these for the books we've done. And in the mainstream, they all say now, yes, monetary policy has income distributive effects. We know that now, which is a research that started in 2007, after the crisis. Before that, virtually impossible to find something. Stiglitz said something on poverty and central banks, but that's about it. But they say, however, in the long run, the effect is neutral. And they have to say that, because if they recognize long-run effects of monetary policy on income inequality, that opens a whole can of worms of questions about the role of policy. And they reach the same conclusion with the environment. Yes, monetary policy can have short-run effects on the environment, but not in the long run. And so the reason that conclusion is important, because then they can, and which they do, and I've got a bunch of quotes that says, you know what, central banks can ignore the environment. Central banks can ignore inequality because they're short-term effects. So, they should not have environmental issues or carbon targets or inequality targets in their reaction function. It's a neat trick. Whereas, post-Keynesians were very clear that there are long-run effects, and I'll talk about that in the second part. Now, if you are doing, like I said, work on income inequality and monetary policy, please reach out to me, because I'd like to invite you to be part of this group. Convergence and stability, right? I mean, this flows from the long-run stability principle. Any disturbances are short-run, and in the long run, the system converges, and converges rather quickly to an equilibrium, which is not a word that we use a lot, but equilibrium or some sort of center of gravitation. And the natural rates of everything that act as a center of gravitation. The natural rate of interest, the natural rate of growth, the natural rate of output, the natural rate of inflation, which is your target, inflation target. Right? Because that 2% target acts as a center of gravitation. Central banks change monetary policy in order to bring inflation down to the target, the center of gravitation. So no matter what kind of changes the mainstream, and this will probably, I'd have to think more, but this probably, applies also to macroeconomics, other aspects of macro, centers of gravitation, neutrality. Two fundamental questions, and I'm just throwing them out, I'm not going to talk about it. Does new consensus models have endogenous money? Right? They have an exogenous interest rate. I don't think they have endogenous money. For me, an definition of endogenous money must reject the natural rate of interest. And so for me, Wiesel doesn't have endogenous money. Although post-Keynesians are very fond of quoting Wiesel. He certainly have, an endogenized mechanism, right? But because he maintains this natural rate of interest, I would argue that Wiesel doesn't have endogenous money. And also, well, the model has exogenous interest rates, but how exogenous are they if the natural rate of interest acts as a center of gravitation? Monetary policy, setting the benchmark rate of interest, is only a step towards the neutral rate, the natural rate. So, it might have some component of exogeneity in terms of controller. Randy Ray has a great paper years ago, if anyone remembers it, where he talks about different exogeneities, exogeneity of control, exogeneity, etc. And it's worth revisiting that paper because, I don't know, it's sort of an endogenous rule. So there's control of the rate of interest because we agree central banks can control, right, the rate of interest. Keynes tells us that central banks can have any rate of interest it wants. Even in Brazil, you can have interest rates of 0 tomorrow. There may be consequences on your exchange rates, but that's a different question, right? There's no question about the control of the rate of interest. But if that rate of interest is subject to a center of gravitation, one must wonder how exogenous it is. Okay. So this is sort of a little, how do we get to inflation targeting? It's essentially, the admission that central banks no longer could control monetary aggregates. Not that they could, but they recognized that they could not control monetary aggregates. And so Gerald Bowie, the former governor of the Bank of Canada, has a great quote I'm very fond of: "We didn't abandon the monetary aggregates, they abandoned us." And, Greenspan, Jerome Powell, it no longer holds this idea. So this was, an admission, but there was also a fear there that they were going to lose control over the anchoring of expectations. If inflation was anchored to the growth of money supply, and if you no longer control that money supply, what anchors your inflationary expectations? And this is where inflation targeting comes in. Instead of trying to target some variable that might have an impact, let's target inflation directly. Let's anchor it. And this is where it comes in, especially since Julia Johnson at McGill, she has a wonderful research program where she's a political scientist, and she has looked at how inflation is characterized by central banks. And it's seen as an evil. And low inflation is seen as a public good. And of course, public goods, everyone wins. So goes the theory. So in central bank minds, targeting inflation and targeting it low produces a public good. That's what it is. Okay. So the inflation target model is simply two components. You change your rate of, when inflation is above target, you raise your interest rate. That has an impact on your IS curve, brings output down, unemployment up. Through your Phillips curve, unemployment goes up, inflation comes down. What I want to argue, and this is a great quote by Philip and Malcolm, it is a long and uncertain chain of events from an adjustment in interest rate controlled by the central bank to a desired change in the rate of inflation. Mimics Keynes' own quote, there are several slips between the cut and the rib. And what I want to show, especially what I want to show on graduate students, is at the end of the analysis, there's nothing left of mainstream model. There's nothing left, both in terms of theory, both in terms of empiricism. And so the model, it's your Humpty Dumpty. And there's no way of putting it back together. And in the end, you have a general monetary policy. Now, in the book on the future of central banking that's coming out, my chapter is called The General Ineffectiveness of Monetary Policy, or the Weaponization of Inflation. So this is what I want to do. I want to deconstruct step by step the model. I do want to say something right away about anchoring agents' inflationary expectations, since I brought it up. And this is crucial, and we hear about it a lot lately, that the reason they have to go very aggressive with interest rate is in order to bring inflation down so that high inflation doesn't remain entrenched in expectations, and therefore labor contracts are indexed, or workers, God forbid, workers would demand for higher wages. So we need to bring the inflation down. But in a recent paper in the Review of Political Economy, which a lot of people have read and commented on, that was a really wonderful coup for the editors to get this paper by a Federal Reserve economist who says, you know what, inflation expectations play no role. Okay, so I just wanted to throw that out. Okay, so I think I've said this before. And this is the model. This is a very typical model. I just copy and pasted it from Romer's, one of Romer's papers. And, you know, you have your output, which is based on your interest rate gap. This is your, you know, your IS rate. This is your Phillips curve. Inflation gap is based on your output gap, although post-Keynes would probably use capacity utilization gap here. And you have your tail rate, where your real rate depends on, you know, your weights and how responsive central banks are to inflation gaps and output gaps. This is probably much higher than gamma 1. No, that's not gamma. What is this? Gamma, yes, gamma. Gamma 0 is greater than gamma 1. Some central banks have sort of dual mandate or some sort of dual mandate, but I question what really that means. Okay, so let's explore the model. The model has 9 steps. I want to talk about inflation target. I want to talk about the United States Phillips curve, natural rate of interest, fine-tuning. Demand-side inflation, central bank independence, and monetary policy dominance, which I referred to earlier. First part, inflation target is 2%. But why 2%? I have to say I've spent months looking at New Zealand research papers from 1980 to 1990 when it was adopted, and I found nothing on why 2%. Nothing. Ben Friedman at Harvard, not related to Milton, good guy, says there's this arbitrariness, right? It's arbitrary, surrounding the current 2% target. In retrospect, the paucity, right? The lack of serious research, the paucity of serious empirical research underlying the identification or the choice of a 2% norm is a professional embarrassment. This is strong words. Emmanuel Carré, in a beautiful article in French, 2014, writes, you know, there's absolutely no economic theory supporting inflation targeting. I mean, before it was adopted, leading up to. And my own research has revealed nothing. And so, you know, where does this 2% come from? I read one paper, where the guy was saying, oh, it probably came from the 2% Maastricht Treaty, that this idea of 2% or something was embedded in our minds. But there's a reporter, a New Zealand reporter, who recently came out, and his working theory, and he's got evidence, and he shows that it was just an off-the-cuff remark by the Minister of Finance in New Zealand in 1989, when asked, well, what are you going to be targeting? And he said, I don't know, 2%. And so he documents that story, which goes to support the arbitrariness and the fact that there's nothing saying why is 2% the preferred. There's also the question of whether IT has been successful. I mean, IT is measured as successful if it leads to a drop in inflation rate. It was adopted in 1990, 1991 in Canada, at a time when inflation had peaked in 1988 and was already on its way down in several countries. So when you look at, the graphs of, you plot the years when inflation targeting was adopted by those early countries, inflation was already on the way down. So you can't really attribute it to inflation targeting. There is a lot of people, maybe in papers that are a bit older, but certainly who question whether it was successful. And I would add to that not only the success of IT should be measured on whether IT brings inflation down, but whether it brings it down in terms of soft landings. I mean, anyone can wreck an economy to bring inflation down, right? So can central banks successfully bring inflation down without creating a hard landing? And this is what is at the heart of the current discussion over monetary policy. David McDonald, I don't have it here, but David McDonald was a Canadian with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. And he looked in Canada, he looked at the Bank of Canada for the past 40 years, and whether in that span of 40 years, whether the Bank of Canada was able to engineer a soft landing and bring inflation down. And the rate of success was 0%. That every time the Bank of Canada tried to bring inflation down, it engineered a recession, and in some cases, a big recession, the 1980 recession. For those of you who are old enough to remember. But, yeah. So whether IT is a success, you know, my paper with Sergio Rossi in 2006, we found that income distribution worse in countries that inflation targets, the wage share fell. So that's something else to take into consideration. Let's go up to the IS curve. So the IS curve is something that some people still talk about. I don't know why, but it has a negative relationship between interest rates and output. And for monetary policy to be successful, that IS curve has to be somewhat elastic, right? You have to have those degrees of freedom. You cannot have interest rates going up and basically having a quasi-vertical IS curve with very little impact on output. So you have to have an elastic IS curve, and that relationship must be well behaved. Right? The curve must be well behaved. So interest rates goes up, and the central banks can affect a rather long portion, you know, over a long portion of output. Well, what's the problem? Yeah, so in old papers by Hall, the more sensitive the response, the more potent is monetary policy. So that's your elasticity right there. So what can we say? Well, there's actually some good research. Stephen Fazzari has been writing about this for quite a while. This is a recent-ish book by Barry, Stephen, and Mark Satterfield. And he says the transmission mechanism for monetary policy to aggregate spending in your consensus model relies on interest sensitivity consumption. It is difficult to find empirical evidence to support the idea that as interest rates increase, consumers reduce consumption. And in fact, this might also include business investment. Some authors have generalized the link to include business investment. But a robust interest elasticity of investment has also been difficult to demonstrate empirically. And most of you know that. I would just say that it's not that investment and consumption are insensitive to interest rates. They're insensitive to incremental changes in interest rates. And that your interest rate has to go up, and this is why central banks end up increasing interest rates 10, 12 times during a cycle. It's because they keep increasing it incrementally, and there's no impact. Very little impact. So they keep increasing it. And eventually, you know, monetary policy, I always said, is clumsy. And it's like a sledgehammer. If you want to kill your fly on the table, you can use a swatter. Or you can use, and you're going to kill your fly, or you're going to kill your table. So, yeah, you raise your interest rate from 0.5 to 5%, and you're going to end up crushing your economy, and that's your hard landing. But with your hard landing, finally, you create enough unemployment to have an impact on inflation. Well, if you don't want to believe a bunch of post-Keynesian kooks, go to the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve, in a recent paper, and which was updated in 2021, Sharp and Suarez, a large body of empirical research, not a little bit of research, right? A large body of empirical research offers mixed evidence at best for substantial interest rate effects on investment. Our research found that most firms claim their investment plans to be quite insensitive to decreases in interest rates and only somewhat more responsive to interest rate decreases. Okay, well, summarized why, at interest rates near the lower bound, investments did not rebound. Investment depends on expectations of the growth of aggregate demand and whether these expected growth in aggregate demand is persistent, long-lasting or not. Very little to do with interest rates per se, unless you raise interest rates to, if you raise interest rates from 0.5 to 5, firms will think that, maybe that expected growth in aggregate demand is not there in the future, so that might impact. But so it's several sips of the coffee, whatever that Krugman is. And Krugman says the same thing, right? It's a dirty little secret, he says. The dirty little secret of monetary analysis, but there's no big support. Maybe on real estate, but not in consumption and investment. And, IMF says the exact same thing. Old papers, 77, already recognizing that the IS curve may not be as potent. So already the first leg of that transmission mechanism is broken. So you have to wonder if the central bank believes that change in interest rates must impact the economy. That first link is broken. What about this? Yes. Even in a Hank Rankin tank models, some people are casting doubt on the empirical validity of intertemporal substitution effects and all of that. Okay, how about the Phillips curve? I apologize, I couldn't do a curve. That's your Phillips curve. And so basically, you have this inverse relationship between inflation, or wage growth, and unemployment. And so that's the second leg of that transmission mechanism. Change in interest rates must impact aggregate demand. And that impact on aggregate demand must be related to inflation. Well, we all know that the Phillips curve doesn't hold much anymore. That what the Phillips curve really kind of looks like is something like this. So this is a typical sort of Kappesian relationship between wage inflation, and here I put rates of capacity utilization. And I could have put unemployment. And what you end up having is this large flat component of your Phillips curve, which means that even if unemployment changes or your capacity utilization changes, it has no impact on prices and inflation. And that if the central bank wants to bring inflation down to here, it must increase interest rates so much that finally they can exploit this part of the curve. Yeah? And so, there's probably a million quotes on this. But the first part is, let's establish the fact that the Phillips curve is important for monetary policy. There you go. You can't do monetary policy if you don't have a Phillips curve. If you don't have a well-behaved Phillips curve. But there you go. I trained Claudio Borio, I did. Again, this quote because I like it so much. Robert Gordon. And I could have put quotes by Powell. I could have put quotes by, who's the former governor of the woman governor of the Fed? Sorry? Janet Yellen, she has a quote on that, and it might be on here. But again, the biz, Bob Solo, this is an article I published in Roke, and it's such a great, no one writes like Bob Solo. He writes in such a beautiful way, non-technical, just very much storytelling, but it was really quite nice. So there's a paper in the Roke issue in 2018, and this was a special issue we did on Milton Friedman. And Robert Gordon, again in the same issue. There you go, the Danny Elgar quote. So, we all know that. And if you don't, and just more quotes and more quotes, more quotes. But, I was accused once of putting too many quotes in my papers. But I like quotes. Because quotes, they establish very well, they anchor well what you're trying to say, especially if you're trying to criticize the mainstream. So one quote is happenstance. 2 quotes, 3 quotes, 10 quotes by powerful people. There you have the pattern. And everybody seems to recognize that the Phillips curve has collapsed. Well, not exactly. It's not that it has collapsed, they say. It's that it was dormant. It was hibernating is one word I saw. And quite like I was saying about the model itself for the past 4 years. But they say, look soon, the Phillips curve is going to come back to life. And this is what they're arguing now. Look at inflation. There you go. We're at full employment in the United States. There you go. It's not surprising that we have high inflation. So, it's important that we keep, and that's why it's important that we keep explaining that, well, this is not your typical inflation. Phillips curve has to do with demand pull inflation. The whole model has to do with demand pull inflation. You raise your interest rate in order to reduce consumption. The model doesn't work if inflation is caused by supply or conflicting claims, whatever you want to call it. It doesn't work. Jamie Galbraith has a nice paper recently where he says, yeah, it's true, but what they're trying to do is increase interest rates so high that it will affect the demand component that will outweigh the supply side causes of inflation. Maybe he's right. And so in the Financial Times, without the Phillips curve, the whole complicated paraphernalia that underpins central bank policy suddenly looks very shaky. For this reason, the Phillips curve will not be abandoned likely. So he's right. If you don't have the Phillips curve, you don't have monetary policy from the mainstream perspective. There is no monetary policy, and this is what post-Keynesians are trying to do to explain how monetary policy works. And that's why, central banks are reluctant to give it up. The natural rate of interest, I'm going to go a bit faster. The natural rate of interest, well, we know it doesn't exist. So you have an unknown acting as a center of gravitation. And ironically, it's now called a neutral rate of interest. But in bringing the benchmark from 0.5, and the neutral rate is about 4% in the United States right now. If you bring the benchmark rate from 0.5 to 4%, it won't be neutral, right? It'll have consequences on the economy. So neutral is sort of a weird word. But there you go. And Borio has been one of the staunchest defender of this idea that it doesn't work. I remember I was at, I asked a central banker once, what's the natural rate? He goes, well, it doesn't exist, but we just assume it exists. You know that joke about the physicist and the chemist and the economist on the desert island, and there's a can of beans? And the economist says, oh, we can open it, we just assume we have a can opener. That's the perfect example. The natural rate doesn't exist, but let's assume it does. And then let's build monetary policy around that. Fine tuning. Well, I wrote a series of papers with Mark Sitterfield on the idea that we need to reject fine tuning because aggregate demand doesn't respond to incremental changes to interest rates, and that you need several increases to generate a hard landing. It's sort of an inefficient way of conducting monetary policy. And by the way, Joan Robinson in 1943, this is a little pamphlet she wrote for a meeting of union workers in England. Very, very much underappreciated, probably not even known very well, but my God, the entire theory of endogenous money is right there in 1943. By the way, I think Joan Robinson is the one who created post-Keynesian economics in 1956. We can discuss that. But there you go. The regulated effect of changing the rate of interest was at best very weak. You know what it means at best very weak? It means it could also be disastrous. At best, it's weak. At worst, it's disastrous. And she reinstates that in 1952. She calls fine-tuning a false scent. And she rejects the conception of an economy which is automatically held on a path of steady development by the mechanism of the rate of interest. But it is by no means easy to see how the monetary mechanism is supposed to ensure how the rate of interest actually assumes its full employment value. The automatic corrective action of the rate of interest is condemned by its very nature to be always too little and too late. John Robinson, amazing. And you know, the accumulation of capital also contains very detailed description of endogenous money. Everybody thinks it's about other things, growth, researching. Okay, so I have been a critic of fine-tuning for a long time. I've criticized other post-Keynesians. You know, in Mark and I, we wrote a paper where we talked about the activist post-Keynesians like Pally, and even Basil Moore was an activist. He believed in, you know, using monetary policy in a fine-tuning way. And others. And Mark and I, we proposed 3 parking rules instead. Let's use monetary policy. Because it's clumsy and because of the reasons I just said. Let's park it at a certain level. It doesn't mean it has to stay there indefinitely, but let's not use it in terms of fine-tuning. And then let's use fiscal policy. I'll have more to say about that later. But yeah, so we developed the MMT rule, the Smithson rule, the Pazinetti rule. And all of these have to deal with income distribution because we argue that monetary policy, first and foremost, is about income distribution. And it's not about aggregate demand, okay? Or maybe it is, but through the channel of income distribution. So that's a very important channel. Maybe you have the interest rate channel, etc. But income distribution channel is just as important. And so let's forego fine-tuning altogether. Demand inflation, I won't say anything more about it, but all inflation results from conflicting claims. And so what that does is if you see inflation in those terms, it leads to very different policy conclusions and very different monetary policy conclusions. Certainly it helps to undermine the issue of fine-tuning. I'll say something else about it, and I know I have a slide at the end. Central bank independence, I'm not going to say a lot about it, but certainly I think central banks are independent in theory. They believe in central bank independence, but they're not independent in practice. Draghi's whatever it takes comments certainly reveals the degree to which it's not independent. You know, when central banks bring interest rates down to zero, you know, not to stimulate the economy as much as to allow governments to spend more and have a lesser burden on debt. You know, central bank independence is probably more a myth. And certainly you have Milton Friedman was a staunch opponent to central bank independence. He didn't trust central bankers. That's why he wanted the monetary rule. Let's tie the hands of the central bankers to a 3% rule, for example. And also in our book on central bank independence and monetary policy, papers by Michel Aglietta, for example, and others. Skidelsky has a paper in there where they kind of comment on the idea of whether it is democratic to have unelected officials carrying out monetary policy. And this becomes even more important, as I'll show at the end, the income distributive nature. And not only that, monetary policy is rooted in social class conflict. Anti-inflation policies of raising interest rates in order to create unemployment is putting the burden of fighting inflation on the backs of workers. Isabella Weber has a great little Guardian piece where she argues, well, let's put the conflict on, let's put the burden on companies. They're making super high profits. Let's tax them. Let's have price controls. Let's shift the burden away from workers. And that's a conversation that we need to be having. Yesterday, the Bank, and also the Bank of England, a year ago, and the Bank of Canada yesterday said workers should not demand pay increases. You're deliberately putting the burden of inflation on workers alone. Why can't central bankers say, you cannot raise your prices during a crisis? You cannot make profits during a crisis or we will be taxing you. Right? So there's a large social conflict part of and then monetary policy dominance. Yeah, so it's the issue, it's the idea that fiscal policy has no role to play, especially in fighting inflation. And even in general macroeconomics, a lot of these models don't have a large role to play for fiscal policy. So and you know, during COVID, that relaxed a little bit. But post-COVID, with inflation, you already have people calling for austerity and a return to old type of economics. So what I wanted to do is to show that the whole theoretical model upon which monetary policy is built upon is theoretically unsound and empirically unsound. And some people, you know, Claudio Borio, inflation has proved rather insensitive to monetary policy easy. So, you know, and if that's the case, then what? And that's the interesting part. It's the then what. Steve Pressman has a blog at the Monetary Policy Institute where he says, the then what is easy. Let's use fiscal policy. Let's tax profits. Let's reduce prices on transportation, like they did in Germany. Now, there's a number of policy choices that we can do in order to fight inflation. Marc Lavoie has this quote. I was trying to find it in the book. Couldn't find it quickly. He says fiscal policy is just as effective in fighting inflation than monetary policy is. absolutely agree. I'll tell you one thing. I had Mark as a teacher back in 1986. I've been a good friend, close to him. I'll tell you how frustrating it is to be a student. Every single time I thought I had an original idea, Mark Lavoie has a paragraph. And I'm going, damn. On the one hand, I go, great, at least I was trying on the right track. But then I can't go around saying, oh, this is an original idea. And it's happened many times. Probably not surprising. Okay. So the model is impotent. Monetary policy is impotent. I'm not the only one saying that. Adair Turner says the same thing. But Adair Turner says these because in terms of fighting inflation, this is what he's saying, maybe, and that's what Claudia Borger is saying. Maybe some monetary policy is not the best way of fighting inflation. Okay. The problem of quoting Lawrence Summers is that you have to probably indicate the day he said that, because he changes his mind constantly, that it's probably not worth quoting. Okay, that's a deconstruction. So the book goes through a lot, and at the end I argue, well, there's nothing left. But then what? How do you rebuild it? And the second part is dedicated to post-Keynesians. So, like I said, Joan Robinson is the one who I think theoretically created post-Keynesian economics. I have a paper coming out in January on that, called The Institutional and Historical Roots of Post-Keynesian Economics. And she was instrumental in creating the institutional school of post-Keynesian economics, which began at the 1970 New Orleans meetings of the American Economic Association that was put together. The meeting was put together by Alfred Eichner and Joan Robinson. And there was a group of about 17 post-Keynesian, Marxist, heterodox people. And then, Alfred Eichner used the word post-Keynesian in his correspondence with Joan. It was a title of the 1975 paper with Jan, Kregel, and even Joan Robinson in the 60s uses the word post-Keynesian to sort of identify the group of Keynesians that are doing work around those topics. I'm not going to talk about endogenous money. I'm not going to talk about exogenous interest rates. I'm not going to talk about the need to reject the natural rate of interest. It's well established. We're all horizontalists now, and I'm not going to talk about that. I'm not going to talk about paying finality that you talked about in your talk, about the payment system and how banks have no limits to the amount of credit they can give out as long as they move in step. It's not like the bank, when you go to the bank and you want to borrow money and he goes, let me see if we have enough reserves. So there's no relationship between reserves and supply of credit. Reserves is something that even some banks have been limiting. Bank of England, Bank of Canada, Bank of New Zealand, and others. No reserves anymore. They're not even called reserves anymore. Central banks call them settlement balances because it's for the settlement in between banks. So I'm not going to talk about that. I'm not going to talk about shadow banks not being banks and not creating money. Too bad for, we mentioned her name, Gabor. She thinks that shadow banks can create money. I don't agree. Anyways, what I want to talk about is monetary policy. I think there's been a lot of talk about theory over the years, and certainly this was the case between the structuralists and the horizontalists between 20 years of feuding. But we've neglected monetary policy. And if you look at the mainstream, they have such advanced research agendas on monetary policy. It's all wrong, but it's very developed. And I think post-Keynesians need to do this more. And I'm very happy when I see young scholars like yourselves I think I asked you guys if you're doing econometrics. Because, I don't do econometrics. I don't think my PhD would be approved today because it has no econometrics. But it's important to do econometrics. And I'm just amazed at how well that's being carried, or Stockstill model. But what I want to say is that from a post-Keynesian perspective, we need to see monetary policy rooted in conflict. There's always a winner and there's always a loser in monetary policy. You raise your interest rates, someone wins, someone loses. So there's a conflict here between the losers and the winners. And the same thing for inflation. Inflation is also rooted in conflict, in these conflicting models. All inflation, either domestic, either at the industry level or at the international level. Oil-producing countries versus non-oil-producing countries. It's a conflict. And I want to say that that conflict extends to gender, to race, and to the environment. Monetary policy is not neutral in terms of gender, not neutral in terms of race. So we need to figure out who's winning and who's losing from the conduct of monetary policy. And the book that I'm editing on gender, for example, they're doing that quite well. And there's a paper by Natalie Marins and Lydia Rollier, yeah, and you're doing a paper on monetary policy, exchange rates, and gender in Brazil. Is that your paper or is it someone else's?
Only until the exchange rate.
Exchange rate. Okay, well, someone else in the book is doing and gender, or maybe in that book is doing something on gender. And she'll be at the conference in Toronto. Move forward, we have to see monetary policy not in terms of the cost channel, interest rate being a cost of lending, a cost of borrowing, a cost of this, a cost of that. Monetary policy must be seen in terms of a revenue, a return on bonds. So when interest rates go up, rentiers, bondholders are winning, which is why John Smith called his book The Revenge of the Rentier. And you have to look at both, because by looking at revenue, you get into class conflict a lot easier. It's like the Indiana Jones movie. Remember when the bad German guy, sorry, there are any Germans here, but he reached for that amulet in the fire and it burnt in his skin. Jeez, I'm talking to a young audience. Everyone's going, we don't know what you're talking about. But he only had one side of the medallion. And because he didn't have both sides, they were digging at the wrong place. Okay. So that's what monetary policy is. If you don't talk about the revenue channel, you're digging in the wrong place. Maybe I'll update the reference with the younger, because of the younger audience. And so there's a paper that Mario Seccareccia and I wrote for the Central Bank of Argentina, and changes in interest rates will generate income. For bondholders, that's the direct mechanism. The direct mechanism is that, well, eventually it might have an impact on labor markets, a fall on the wage share, etc. And the wealth channel is, we have to talk about that. How it introduces asset inflation, which benefits. And then if you go a step further than this, who holds those bonds? White men. Who gains wealth from bubbles? White men. And for the labor market distortions, which industry is more gender specific, and are these industries more susceptible to monetary policy changes? Early evidence by Stephanie Seguino, for example, Melanie Long again, indicates that women are more sensitive, work in these more precarious jobs that are often the first ones to go in a downturn. I covered these. But I do want to, specify that the MMT rule suggests that the nominal rate of interest should be 0, which we had pretty much since the 2007 crisis. The Smithson rule, John Smithson was very happy with that name, the real rate of interest should be 0. And the Pazinetti rule is when the real rate of interest equals the growth rate of labor productivity. So the nominal rate of interest should equal to inflation plus labor. But all these rates have to do with income distribution. And they have to do with what is the euthanasia of the rentier? Is it a real rate or is it a nominal rate in Keynes? Keynes doesn't say so. But there's a big debate, or was, between Ramy and John about that, about who was right about the euthanasia of the rentier. And I'll just give you, and I think that's probably the last slide. This is the Pazinetti index. And like I said, it's the real rate equal to labor productivity. The blue one is the normal, the traditional Pazinetti index with labor productivity. And you can see that starting at around 19, and when it is positive, it means that that's a positive, that's a, shift towards the rentiers from a monetary policy perspective. And we see that from about 1977 until about 2010, so for almost 3.5 decades, monetary policy favored the rentier class. The red line is the labor augmented Pazinetti, which instead of using labor productivity, we actually use wage increases. Okay. And so, because wage increases didn't keep up with labor productivity, you see a greater shift towards bond holders. And only around 2010 has monetary policy benefited workers. And so, based on this, what I concluded with Mario Seccareccia is that not only is monetary policy rooted in conflict that is about income distribution, but monetary policy must be seen in terms of an incomes policy that favor rentiers. Monetary policy is an incomes policy. It has nothing to do with demand. It's about income. And it's not just short-lived. Okay? It's a permanent sort of incomes policy. And that raises a bunch of questions. And then, what got me going on this line of research, and although I've been a student of Marx since '86, but when I worked on the Money in Motion book, does anyone know the book Money in Motion? Okay, best book. You got an article in there. The best book ever on monetary policy. It's got 30 chapters or so. Dinsky, Lavos, Seccareccia, Minsky, Moore, Graziani, Poland. Alan made.
No.
No, he's not in there. But it's just really a great book. The introduction by Ed Nell and Justin Laplace is worth reading just for that. So Mark writes, it then becomes clear. What that means pretty much the argument that I presented earlier on, the breakdown, the collapse of the mainstream model. Well, it becomes clear that monetary policy should not so much be designed to control the level of activity, but rather to find the level of interest rates that will be proper for the economy from a distribution point of view. The aim of such a policy should be to minimize conflict over the income shares, conflict inflation, in the hope of simultaneously keeping inflation low and activity high. Okay? That's it. Thank you. I skipped a lot of stuff, but I'm open to, what's this? I'll just quote, oh yeah. The first paper to talk about income distribution And monetary policy was a paper by Chris Nichol, right? Gary, you know Chris, right? He wrote a paper in 1988. And he says, look at that. Monetary policy can affect the functional distribution in income and thus the personal distribution, change market values of financial assets, and that can also lead to unemployment, those labor market distortions. Chris Nichol in 1988, 89, the first paper to talk about, from a post-Keynesian perspective, to talk about that. Basel has a paper in the same year as well, but I didn't quote it here. Thank you very much. Questions?
To be able to.
No. Questions? I'll go with you.
Was bad to, in fact, I have a question.
Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. No? 4. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Ignacio, first, thanks for the presentation.
You have to speak louder because I'm old.
Okay. It's really interesting for me, this idea of the right of interest, like a distributing role. I was glad that one of the essays was published by the Argentinian Central Bank, that is my country. Apparently they didn't read it because now they are raising interest rates to low inflation. Okay. Apart from that, my question is about, and this is what we were talking with the group that this is our topic. How do you think about possible international distribution effects of interest rates? For example, because we see here the between class, for example, rentiers and workers, but I think that this focus inside a national.
Yeah.
For example, we were thinking if the US raised the interest rate, and for example, that could benefit rentiers in the US, and maybe, I don't know, rentiers in Argentina could lose if this, I don't know, outflow of capital, devaluation, and all that. So if there are words or in this study group, somebody's thinking about the international effects of the.
Not that I know of, but thank you. And I'll definitely keep it, you should write something. No, I mean, the idea that there are losers and winners must apply to the international level, and the United States is a good country to use for that. It's always winning with something. And in terms of conflicting claims, there you go, and imposing hardship on other countries. Thank you I will take that into consideration. 2.
Well, actually, thank you, Rochon, for the talk. I will have 2 questions, just to make it easy. First of all, I would like to hear about the thoughts on, I think we have 2 strains or 2 roads that most kingdoms are now following with that monetary policy. The first one that you presented, monetary policy solving or not solving the conflict and distribution and so on, and also financial stability. You sadly those ways. Do you think they are compatible at some point, or they are just different roads?
No, they're completely compatible because we have a book coming out on financial stability. And I think, and we also have a book coming out on policy implementation. And I think that a lot of that has to do with how interest rates are implemented, which has nothing to do with the consequences of it. But even on financial instability, I mean, like I said, if you push interest rates high enough, you're going to have a bunch of consequences. And I focused on income distribution, but you can also go further and say, that might have consequences for the stability of the system. So I see no problems with the presentation that was before me and mine. I think we're just different pieces of that puzzle, is what I think.
Thank you. And the second one is more like, about, when you talk about fine tuning something and all that stuff, that monetary policy should operate in a smooth way. I would like to hear from you, if you look from the viewpoint of political economists, it's not just a prescription that gives room to banks and other financial institutions to adapt to these changes, and that's why we need to do so. I think vocal rule is a trauma. The vocal shock is a trauma for everyone. And how do you think this? It can have some roots of political economy, or I don't know if it is more of some records.
Yeah, the Volcker shock for sure. I think central banks have learned enough from the Volcker period not to go back to that. But I think but that doesn't mean that they can engineer soft landing. And if they do, great. I'm not a fan of how they do it, but if that's what they do, great. But studies in Canada, and Josh Bivens did a similar study that shows that, you can't, it's difficult to engineer a soft landing using interest rates. And the reason is that because of that flat portion of your IS curve, it has no impact. So you keep raising interest rates, and by the time it has an impact, it's too late. And I think that for central bankers, there's an issue of credibility involved. If they don't do this, they're perceived as not credible. We know that the ECB was criticized along those, we accused the ECB of not being credible and not being responsible by delaying increases in interest rates until July of this year. The Bank of Canada was criticized of losing credibility if it wasn't being more forceful. And that kind of raises the question of blinding vested interests. There's a great book by Clément Fontaine and a few others, Deitch, and the title of the book is Who do central banks serve? And who said yes? Oh yeah, okay. But I thought you read it. It's a great book. And Mario Seccareccia in the Journal of Economic Issues has a similar paper about vested interests. Gerald Epstein, of course, wrote the seminal work on this idea that central banks are not independent because they are they need the approval of financial markets. And so you can bring in political economy there a lot to explain what they do. And for me, it's always been a mystery because central bankers have access to the exact same data as I do. Surely they can't reach such dramatic different conclusions. So they must be aware that when they raise interest rates, they have a whole army of researchers. When you raise interest rates, oh, sir, I say sir because it's mostly men, it's not having the impact. And so, but they can't say, oh, you know what? Monetary policy is rooted in conflict. So let's wait before raising interest rates. They don't do that. So they have to because they lose credibility from those that they depend on. Okay? 1, 2, 3, 4.
Okay. Thank you for your presentation. It was very, very nice. Lots of things to think about. But this topic of central bank independence is a hot topic now, and it's a hot topic beyond the academic boundaries. For instance, on Tuesday, Financial Times published an article written by Chris Giles, Giles, he's a journalist.
Yeah.
And the article is called Central Bank Independence is on the Decline. This is Financial Times. And the main message of this article is Okay, it is good, it is important to protect central bank from populist presidents and prime ministers and so on. And he was thinking about I forgot the name of the politician that is probably going to be appointed as a prime minister in the United Kingdom. Mistress, yes. Because apparently she is stating that she wants central bank to have a target in growth also. So the message was, okay, we have to protect central banks from these attacks from populists, but you know, one thing is a populist from Turkey, or populist from a periphery, but now we have this at home. And then the suggestion was, okay, I don't think central banks must go for growth also, but they should be more accountable. Central banks, they have at least to be more accountable. So they have to respond for what they are doing and for their mistakes also in inflation, in achieving its target on inflation. But my point is, I see this whole thing moving now. And this was not the first paper in the newspapers about that in the last month. They are, we can see everywhere this information. And I don't think we are going to have a revolution in this topic, because we are in the middle of something inside the mainstream, as you told us. The role model, the whole model is falling apart, but there is no, I don't see at least, a new model, to replace that. But would you agree that at least we would be moving in a direction where central banks are, as central banks want to be the leaders in terms of macroeconomic policy, and a new institutionality would be built, trying to put together fiscal policy and monetary policy, and trying to coordinate at least these two policies. I mean, the idea of it's all about central banking, doing fine-tuning and monetary policy, and they are able to fight inflation and to pull economy and push economy. I think that this is falling apart. But what is coming? Do you see that is coming to replace that?
Yeah. So let me say that the leader-to-be of the Conservative Party in Canada said that if he becomes prime minister, he will fire the governor of the Bank of Canada. And he got shit on by newspapers, academics, etc. Second, I said in my presentation that central banks believe in central bank independence in theory, not so much in practice. But if you talk to academics, they will all say that central bank independence is important. I had a conversation with Barry Aikengreen, and Barry is the one who built that central bank independence index. So they built an index of central banks around the world, and high scores mean they're more independent than other. And some students are using that in econometric models to show that the more independent that you are, the more, academics are still very much behind the idea of central bank independence. I think perhaps for ideological reasons, more than anything else. Central banks are a little bit more, central bank, we call them central bank practitioners for a reason, and they practice monetary policy I think they are a lot more Draghi. Draghi saw the collapse of the European Union. What did he say? Nope, we're gonna do everything we can to save it. So that was a moment of great pragmatism from the central bank who said, it's not the time to be independent. The other argument is, maybe central banks are less independent in a foxhole, to paraphrase Mankiw's expression. We're all Keynesian during a crisis. Maybe during a crisis, central banks recognize that they're less independent, but they go back to supporting independence in good times. I don't know. I think it's one of those core elements of central bank that they will defend at all costs, even though that in practice, they go a long way to. Yes.
Yeah, thank you
Jay,
for
and then- What?
thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah.
I want to ask, is inflation the panacea for economic growth for a particular country? Why do I say that? When we talk about inflation, a lot of things come to mind. This. You can look at the PPI, the CPI for the particular growth of the country. And in some situations, the results are not the reality. This is a situation a central bank can manipulate inflation in a country by reducing its interest rate or maintaining it to a certain level so that it can beat the inflationary figure. So I'm a bit baffled with that. So I see a little bit conflict in that angle. So I want to know whether the inflation is a panacea for a growth of a particular economy. And I also want to know if inflation can be to 0%, if it's possible, and what are the effects?
Of course, it's possible. If we've had a period of deflation, surely zero inflation is possible. Let me answer this by saying, I'm not a big fan. I'm not a big fan of talking about inflation and growth as objectives. I think that first and foremost, as an objective, we have to kind of agree on what kind of society we want to live in. And then figure out using taxes and spending and maybe interest rates, how to get that. If you want to live in a country with huge discrimination, inequality, no health system, no national public educational system, no abortion, go live to the United States, go. You'll pay less taxes, great. But if you want to live in a society where, women decide what to do with their bodies, men decide, I don't know what men would decide to do with their body, but the point is, where everybody, there's no restrictions like that, national health care, national public education, great education. In Canada, we now have national daycare, $10 a day per child. National drug care is coming. We have national health care. We've got our problems. But in general, if that's what you want, then good. Come to Canada, and then let's figure out, you know what, maybe we need to tax the rich more. Maybe we have to tax corporate profits more. Maybe we have, then we can figure out together what we can do to get the society. So when I see things like growth, we have to have more growth, I never bought into that argument. You can have, look in the United States, you can have growth. Poverty, mortality rates, bad education, except Colorado, great school. But you know what I mean? So I think we have to shift that discussion to de-emphasize specific economic objectives. Growth doesn't give you anything. Growth probably makes the rich richer. So why would we have more growth? Yeah.
The second question.
Oh, no, yes.
The second question is, looking at the exchange rate of a particular country.
I'm sorry?
The exchange rate of a country, do the central bank have that kind of control to control its currency on this exchange rate market at the world market? If not, why? And who has that power to control the exchange rate in the world market? And what are the mechanisms used in controlling or predicting for the exchange rate?
Exchange rate.
Yeah.
So that's another question altogether. Let me say, I'm not sure what you mean by control of the currency. I don't know what that means. Do you mean interest rate? Do you mean the currency supply?
Currency supply.
Why talk about currency supply?
Because we are talking about, I'm talking about the currency supply because we are talking about the development of a country, some of the indicators, looking at the inflation which causes the inflationary effect of the country, which reduces the growth of a particular country.
I don't know what the growth of the money supply means, the growth of the currency, honestly. Economists used to talk about that years and years ago, and we don't. No one talks about currency or growth of the currency anymore in that sense. So I wouldn't know what to answer. Sorry. Jay.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation, really appreciate it. Like you said, the data is very, very useful. I was wondering, if you have a take on a piece that, I've been wondering what's the position generally, in your personal position as well, on the asset purchase programs, because that obviously is something that is a consequence of the impotence of monetary policy that you mentioned earlier, and now we have a massive balance sheet that really knows what to do with exactly. So I was wondering if you have any take on that.
For me, the paper of reference on quantitative easing is one from the Bank of England. And in it, they say, and this is in, Janet Yellen said that when she was governor, the two objectives that they say quantitative easing does is that it lowers interest rates on long-term bonds. And second, it gives liquidity to banks, and therefore banks can start lending more. So during the crisis, the fact that banks were not lending was interpreted as a lack of liquidity. This is your money multiplier law. We have no deposits, you can't lend. But we know that banks don't need deposits to lend. Banks are only constrained by creditworthy bonds. Again, John Robbins, in 1915. So, asset purchase, and as for the first part, asset purchases was required to lower the rate of interest on long-term bonds. Randy and Scott wrote a very good reading paper 10 years ago, I don't know. I don't think they've ever published it, but it's an important paper where they say that's nonsense. If the bank wants to lower the rate on the long-term bonds, they simply have to lower it. You don't have to go through the mechanism of quantitative. And this is Keynes too. Keynes tells us that the bank can't have short-term and long-term. And that paper by Randy and Scott was very, very important for me in understanding that. So you don't need to do quantitative easing to lower long-term rates, just announce it. Okay? And as for the second reason, well, we don't live in a bank multiplier model, so we don't need it. So the theoretical reasons for quantitative easing are flawed. So why did they do it? I think you have to understand that in terms of contested terrain, of vested interest, that it led to a massive increase in financial markets. And again, who holds financial assets? Predominantly white men. So it created an asset bubble in my mind, and that you know, again, there are losers, there are winners, and wealthy people gained from that. What did you want to hear?
No, that's a good answer. I was wondering, just, there's a slight distinction between the very first initial QE1 and the later ones.
Yeah,
You're still progressing.
Yeah.
For us at the beginning, it wasn't full solved.
I'd have to look at it more carefully and think about it more carefully. But, you know, I would probably argue, I know that the second one that expanded who they could buy it from, so don't quote me, but I would probably say the second round was probably the first round on steroids. Don't quote me, I'd have to think about it more. Another question here. But there was someone there first, and then I'll go to you. Yes.
Yeah, I'd like to have your views on the ECB. They are planning to start increasing the interest rates, but at the same time they design a kind of protection instrument or something like that. So
To reduce the spread between Germany and
yes, much easier because the ECB and Fed are very different in terms of economics and different aspects of it. So let's have you and why we need this protection instrument in this kind of environment now, because we have a fiscal expansion during the COVID, because in 19 and now we are trying to have the Ukraine war. So why do we need it?
You need it because the euro is a flawed system. They've created a false monetary union, right? Because most sovereign countries have a sovereign currency. In the case of the euro, I'm not sure how sovereign it is because it doesn't answer to any one country. So it's a weird arrangement. And on top of that, you have monetary union without fiscal union, or at least fiscal transfers. And so because you have that, it creates discrepancies between core, you know, Germany essentially, and maybe a little bit France, and other countries. And so because you have that, and because the spreads on bonds, different countries, they need to have some sort of a way of containing it. And so this was the latest arrangement. I think short of abandoning the euro or short of getting into a fiscal union was probably sort of the best Band-Aid they could invent. And going back to central bank independence, why is this? I mean, I'm not against it, but I'm saying, why is an independent central bank intervening on national markets to prop up, to reduce spreads of specific countries? So that's not really, again, independent in theory, but not in practice. Yes.
Oh, thank you so much for your lecture. I'm especially interested on the what we may call the distributional channel of monetary policy. As far as I'm concerned, there is a lot of things written from the theoretical point of view. And so my question is, how much empirical evidence exists on this topic? And if you could go further on this topic.
Sure. So this issue, as I said, goes back to post-Keynesians to 1989.
Yeah,
To
Nichols,
Chris
right?
Nigel and Basil. Basil's take was a little bit interesting because he thinks that interest rates affect the markup of firms. And then you see, there you go, that's the conflict. And that impacts on inflation if firms are able to pass that over. So his was a very interesting take on it. But so, and then that was kind of dormant until I kind of got interested in 1996, 1999. I didn't do anything about it, but Lavoie had a few papers on there with Seccareccia. And then it's really only in the last 4 years that I started really turning my attention to that question with Silvio Kappes, your director, Brazilian. So we're doing a lot of work on that. A lot of theoretical work. Silvio has an amazing paper coming out in the Review of Political Economy. I don't know when. He does a survey. And, one of the reasons I got interested in it a lot in recent years is because the mainstream is taking over that topic. They did nothing until the crisis, and now they've got tons of papers. There's probably 20 papers published since this morning. They've done tons of papers, and they've done a lot of empirical papers. And that's dangerous, because if they take over the conversation, they dictate the conclusions. And their conclusion is it's short-term only. So some people have used words like it's a side effect. It's a side effect of good, solid monetary policy, anti-inflation policies. So it's a side effect. So if it's a side effect, we can just ignore it. Well, why are we even talking about that if it's just short-run effects? And that's the danger of them dictating the conclusions. And that was the reason why Silvio and I approached the governor of the Bank of Italy through someone else, because we wanted to have an opportunity of having heterodox people in an otherwise orthodox environment or within orthodox environment, and hopefully some of the orthodox will say, oh, wow, that's a good paper. And you're right, we need empirical research, because I was talking to the Bank of England 4 or 5 years ago, and I had convinced them to do a conference on monetary policy and income distribution. And I'm great, months go on and they don't invite me. And I contact them and go, this was my idea, why am I not invited? And they go, yeah, but we don't really understand what you talk about. And the idea was, I don't have a Hank model, whatever. And so therefore they don't understand me. And so at the very least, if we don't have a DSG model, we should at least have some sort of econometrics, empirical, VAR model that are very trendy. At least they understand that, and we can have a conversation. With Silvio, we're writing a paper with a PhD from UMKC, who's doing a VAR model using the Pasinetti index. And so that's it. And we're trying to develop a core group of about 15 scholars who will do work on that. Also along gender, etc. And that's what we want to develop and start a formal research, post-Keynesian research group on monetary policy and inequality. So if anyone is interested, please send me an email and we can start talking because we want to do issues of gender, issues of race, inequality in general, and someone in the United States wants to look at whether, I'm not sure it's worth looking at if there is a question of segregated markets in the United States, whether it affects more one region more than the other, et cetera, worth looking into. Thank you. Yes?
Just one question. Thank you for the talk.
I wore a shirt for this and pants. Nice pants.
I wonder whether you talk most exclusively about monetary policy and also in the channels, called channel, the revenue channel. So I think that it is important to consider the coordination between fiscal and monetary policy. Also in the mainstream, many of the mainstream channels in monetary policy wouldn't work without. Also the Volcker shock was accompanied with the fiscal austerity. So what we generally think is, as we have pandemic to monetary policy, actually has happened to the interaction between monetary and fiscal policy. So I wonder whether you think that considering the interaction always considering monetary policy conditional to what fiscal policy is important.
Yeah, so I have a paper on that from about 2010 where I argue that I favor a permanent policy of low interest rates, real interest rates, non-zero real interest rates. The part that we call the parking view, what Lavoie renamed the distributional view. of monetary policy. He's got about 4 pages in his book, based on my research on that. So a permanent, low interest rate policy, and of course, you need an active fiscal policy to, for the standard post-Keynesian or Keynesian objectives. But not in terms of growth, but in terms of, I think this whole emphasis, but in terms of, and I welcome all this literature on growth, fine, but, first deciding on, what you want to reduce. Look in Canada, just came out in Canada, that during COVID, the government gave every Canadian 16 years and older, every Canadian $2,000 a month, okay? The result was a decline in poverty by 25%. And so that's the proof that poverty is easy to get rid of. Homelessness is easy to get rid of. You just need a government. You need the political will to do something about it. Now, I'm sure the government did not have the objective of reducing poverty, but all these basic income models, all these job guarantee models, we know that, first of all, let's agree, there's no fiscal constraint. The idea that, we can't, the Raynard Rogoff model, or we can't afford this and that, we can't afford it. We can't afford it. The pandemic was proof. Did you know the deficit in Canada went from 30 billion to 400 billion. That's the deficit. All these constraints evaporated overnight. I remember years ago, Joël Leclerc, Canadian, now a professor in the US, in Buffalo, she gave a paper on precisely this, from an MMT perspective. She was laughed at. She was crying. Okay, this is like 10, 12 years ago. Fast forward to today, and we know that governments have no fiscal constraints. And no one during the pandemic talked about austerity. There was sort of this secret consensus. But now, post-austerity, all these post-COVID, these issues are coming back. But, never can a government say we can't afford to do this or that. In Canada, we just figured out, we just created national daycare. We'll figure out how to make it work. So, yeah. So as a post-Keynesian, I do believe in fiscal policy. And I also believe in sort of an accommodative, a low real interest rate rule for central banks. And then that goes to your question as well. Coordination, absolutely coordination. No, but there's a lot to say on that, and I'm just trying to figure out whether I should say more or just. I heard someone over there say, "Shut up." Maybe it was just the guy in my head. If that's all, thank you very much.